goes there?
The Teleport Media Podcast.
Welcome to the Teleport Media Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Wall. In this episode, we will discuss ghosts and ghost story narrative. We're going to examine some of the narrative rules behind ghost stories, and we're going to see what happens when you follow those rules and when you break them. We'll also give a little nod to Christmas ghosts, as it is the appropriate season. And I'll share with you a significant tabletop resource for me when it comes to creating ghosts and ghost stories. So this is a true story, and as fantastical as some of the elements of it are, I promise you that by the end, you'll believe it's true as well. This is a story of how I met the devil in the park out behind my home in a suburban development in St. John's, Newfoundland. It was late 2020, first couple of weeks of November. COVID had really put a cramp on my mindset, and I had received some news that I would normally find distressing, but because of just the weight of the pandemic, this news was catastrophic to me. It overwhelmed me. It pushed me to the absolute edge. I've never been one to be suicidal, but that doesn't mean that I haven't contemplated the idea before and considered it and rolled it over in my mind, and this is about as bad as it ever got for me. So I received this distressing news, and I decide I can't sit still. I gotta go for a walk. Fortunately, there's this nice park nearby my house. It's a great little space. It gives me some peace of mind, a little walking trail between a couple of baseball diamonds. It's perfect. It's exactly what I need. And so I grab my phone, I stuff my headphones in my ears, and I head out to walk in the park. Now, I'm so distressed I don't even bother to put any music on or anything. I just don't want to talk to anyone, so I just put my headphones in to avoid overly friendly people. And I walk out into the dark. And I say that because daylight savings time has just flipped over. And so things are significantly darker in this park than they normally would be. It's almost as though maybe the maintenance crew hasn't reset the lights or anything like that. There are normally lights that come on around the baseball fields, but it's like they're not coming on as soon as they should. So the park is just in pitch blackness. This also happens in Newfoundland at a certain time of year. It just gets to the point where darkness just descends. And for a couple of months, you can go through these long nights. But I'd been living in Newfoundland for about 12 years at this point, and I didn't really think anything of it. I just trudged along because I needed to move. I was so emotionally distressed. I wanted to leave my body. That was kind of how I was itching on the inside to get out of me. And so I'm walking along this very familiar path, and I'm letting my thoughts tear through my mind. And I light upon the notion, kind of the unfairness of my situation. and my disappointment that, there is no divine justice, that there is no peace that passes all understanding. There is no loving God there to support me in my time of need. I'm not ashamed to say that, these are definitely moments when I've contemplated kind of the other end of the spectrum. What if I sold my soul? What if I tried to summon something up? I mean, I'm at my wit's end, so why the hell not? And so, yeah, I start thinking. I don't think I'm talking out loud, but I'm definitely thinking. And I'm thinking about the devil, I'm thinking about bargains, I'm thinking about how life isn't fair, and how I wish that something would come to me and at least give me an offer to make it all better. Why can't I even get that? And I'm trudging along the gravel path. Past the baseball diamond, there are trees ahead of me. I can hear a stream to my left. There's kind of a stream bank with lots of brush nearby. And I look ahead and I can't see anything. It's just blackness in front of me. And as I'm thinking these thoughts about selling my soul, something resolves on the path ahead of me. At first, it is the very kind of briefest of images, shadow on shadow. But as I continue to move ahead, it starts to grow more detailed. It has features. There's a body. I can make out a head, 2 arms, 2 legs. And it's walking. It's walking down the path at me, coming from the opposite direction. It looks like it is struggling against physics. Kind of like it doesn't typically walk on planet Earth, but more kind of swims through the gravity of our physical space. And so as it walks and swims toward me, it resolves further. There are no real features. I just definitely detected a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs. It was shorter than me. It was broader, thicker. And it had in one of its hands, its right hand, some sort of elongated object. At first I thought maybe a rod, a staff, something like that, but no, it turned out to be this twin-tendrilled whip that was kind of floating beside it. And it continued to walk toward me along the path, dragging this whip beside it, fluttering ever so lightly. And this broad, short, impish creature was gaining on me now. It was picking up speed. We were going to collide. We were going to meet. Now, all of this happened in a matter of seconds. And I don't really recall if I thought much of anything, except maybe my thoughts might have had something in common with the warning from the case of Charles Dexter Ward, "Do not call up that which you cannot put down." Because I definitely had the thought that I was in over my head. And so this thing, this squat little imp, this messenger from hell that I had conjured up was coming right at me down the gravel path. And I panicked, and I drew off to the side. I swerved off the path and into the grass. I fell into the grass. It was wet. It soaked my coat. And I looked up at this thing that I knew was approaching me. And I don't know whether it was maybe the change of the angle, and maybe I actually, caught a glimpse of the moon, and so there was a little bit more light. Maybe some street lights had even come on nearby the park, but I look over and I see a woman in a very thick snow coat, pitch black, walking a pair of schnauzers on a lead. And that is my ghost story. That is how I met the devil in Kiddygall Park. It's all in the mind, So why tell you that absolute clunker of a ghost story? I mean, it doesn't exactly inspire belief in the supernatural. If anything, it kills it dead right there on the trail where I met the lady and her 2 dogs. Well, the reason is I recently picked up a book called The Theory of the Weird Tale. It's an edited volume by S.T. Joshi. In it, he gathers together works from early weird tale authors ranging from Henry S. Whitehead and Arthur Machen, all the way back to like Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe. And I mean, he's even got Lovecraft and some others in there as well. Horace Walpole, Algernon Blackwood. It's a pretty diverse collection for the time and, the authors that are really available from that time period to discuss the weird tale. And each of these authors has kind of a piece, maybe an essay or the introduction to a book or a story collection where they discuss what the weird tale is all about, what the supernatural is all about in terms of its place in literature. And amidst all of these is an essay published in 1829 called On the Supernatural in Fictitious Composition. So this was written by Walter Scott. And I was not the biggest fan of this essay when I picked it up. I admit it took a gut check on my part to get to the end. It hit me like a wall of text. It didn't have any kind of familiar, comfortable qualities that I could really latch onto as a contemporary reader. But in gutting it out, I was rewarded with a bit of history on an author that Scott admired, a German author named E.T.A. Hoffmann. And the way that Scott talks about Hoffmann, he is a man who is consumed and terrified and chased and eventually devoured by the creations of his own imagination. We do not mean to say that the imagination of Hoffmann was either wicked or corrupt, but only that it was ill-regulated and had an undue tendency to the horrible and the distressing. Thus he was followed, especially in his hours of solitude and study, by the apprehension of mysterious danger to which he conceived himself exposed, and the whole tribe of demigorgons, apparitions, and fanciful spectres and goblins of all kinds with which he has filled his pages, although in fact the children of his own imagination were no less discomposing to him than if they had a real existence and actual influence upon him. The visions which his fancy excited are stated often to be so lively that he was unable to endure them, and in the night, which was often his time of study, he was accustomed frequently to call his wife up from bed, that she might sit by him while he was writing, and protect him by her presence from the phantoms conjured up by his own excited imagination. And this is exactly what I experienced on this trail. I was attacked by a being conjured from my own imagination. I was the victim of the human propensity to seek out patterns and the familiar when encountering something in the darkness. And I say it's the human propensity because this is not something unique to me or even unique to a small part of the population. Anyone can have an experience like this. This is part of the chemical makeup of the human brain, run through the mechanisms of culture. And there's no reason we can't do that or make use of that when we run a role-playing game. And this perspective on E.T.A. Hoffmann actually dovetails very nicely with a statement that Walter Scott makes at the beginning of the essay, which is that the supernatural in fiction is more marvelous the less you see of it. If you overexpose the supernatural, you make it vulnerable to criticism. If you look too long at the dark specter on the trail, it becomes a woman and her dogs. So the solution is never do full frontal. Keep your supernatural creatures just out of sight, just out of reach. And if you can do that, they will be all the more marvelous to the people that are interacting with them through literature or through a game. Now, if we take these two ideas together and amalgamate them, we get something really special. We get the capacity for the GM in a game to hint at something, to give ever so slight exposure to the supernatural, and then we allow the players to do the rest, because the players' minds will do the heavy lifting for you. That's the brilliant part of the supernatural in game fiction. And as we're approaching Christmas in the Western world, we have one of the best folklore motifs to work with when it comes to this sleight of hand, no full frontal approach to the supernatural, and that is the Christmas ghost. I'm not from the UK myself, but I spent a little bit of time there. Like a lot of American kids, I was introduced to Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol when I was younger, and watched many different movie versions of it. The one with the Muppets being my personal favorite. Now that I live in Newfoundland, I'm quite comfortable borrowing the idea of the Christmas ghost as a tradition and making it my own. So on this episode, we're going to be looking at ghosts. We're going to be diving into how do we bring this partial exposure, incomplete exposure to the player's side of the table when we're sitting on the other side of the table, very clearly knowing how the sausage is made. So as we dive into some specific examples of ghosts that I want to bring to the table, and ghost stories, and some classic and modern ghost story writers that I think it would benefit everyone listening to this to read over at least once. I want to start with a book by Mark Fisher called The Weird and the Eerie. And specifically, I want to look at Fisher's definition of the eerie. It's a two-pronged approach. I find it particularly fascinating and useful because it gives you a couple of different directions from which you can pursue this obscured representation of the supernatural in your stories. The eerie is constituted by a failure of absence or by a failure of presence. The sensation of the eerie occurs either when there is something present where there should be nothing, or there is nothing present when there should be something. We can grasp these two modes quickly by means of examples. The notion of an eerie cry, often cited in dictionary definitions of the eerie, is an example of the first mode of the eerie, the failure of absence. A bird's cry is eerie if there is a feeling that there is something more in or behind the cry than a mere animal reflex or biological mechanism, that there is some kind of intent at work, a form of intent we do not usually associate with a bird. An example of the second mode of the eerie, the failure of presence, is the feeling of the eerie that pertains to ruins or other abandoned structures. Post-apocalyptic science fiction, whilst not in itself necessarily an eerie genre, is nevertheless full of eerie scenes. Yet the sense of the eerie is limited in these cases, because we are offered an explanation of why these cities have been depopulated. Compare this with the case of the abandoned ship the Mary Celeste, because the mystery of the ship, what happened to the crew, what made them leave, where did they go, has never been resolved, nor is ever likely to be. The case of the Mary Celeste is saturated with the sense of the eerie. Behind all the manifestations of the eerie, the central enigma at its core is the problem of agency. In the case of failure of absence, the question concerns the existence of agency as such. Is there a deliberative agent here at all? Are we being watched by an entity that has not yet revealed itself? In the case of the failure of presence, the question concerns the particular nature of the agent at work. I think where it's often difficult to conjure things like real scares or horror at the gaming table, even when you're playing a game like Cult or Call of Cthulhu or any other horror game, I think the eerie is an achievable goal at the gaming table. I think that given your opportunity, you can present something eerie and disconcerting and uncomfortable to your players, and it will bypass the chips and soda and the in-person distractions that you might experience normally in your chosen entertainment venue, whether that's online through Discord or a similar service, or in person at a table. Because it's a lot to convince somebody to be horrified in a game space. I mean, if you think about the typical game convention, this isn't the sort of place, even if it is a horror game convention or somewhere where horror games are welcome, that space is not going to be conducive to outright horror. But eerie you can probably get away with, because eerie is happening mainly in the player's own minds. And the beauty part of Fisher's interpretation of the eerie is that you can hit the players from either end so that they don't see you coming. You can either present them with a situation where something awful should be there and it's not, or you present them with a situation where something awful does appear. And either way, it's unexpected. And most importantly for our purposes, the players' imaginations are doing the work for us. So we have our two rules. Walter Scott telling us no full frontal, and Mark Fisher telling us that the eerie is either the undermined expectation of absence or the undermined expectation of presence. So let's see some examples of these rules in play. And I think the best place to start would be some stories by M.R. James. I don't think you can get much better in terms of examples. I'm going to go over a handful of these. I am not going to do the usual ones. Definitely there have been enough podcasts and other kind of media formats that have covered Casting the Runes and A Warning to the Curious. So instead, I'm going to go over some more kind of obscure ones and see how these rules relate. So the first story by M.R. James that I kind of read in preparation for discussing ghosts and ghost stories is called Rats. This was my first time reading it, and I was initially disappointed because it was kind of a misnomer. Rats is really not about rats. There's just kind of a comment about rats at the beginning of it. And what it is about is kind of a haunted bed and breakfast. And this is one of M.R. James's physical ghosts, a fully formed corpse of a person who is moving around in such a way as to excite, because this person is very definitely dead. The narrator, who's presumably kind of an M.R. James insert, stays at this country house. And the country house has a variety of guest rooms, but there is one particular room in the middle of his floor that is unoccupied and is not cleaned up and suitable for a guest to inhabit. So the narrator, naturally kind of curious, waits until the rest of the guests and even the hosts of the house are out for the day, and then decides to explore this room. And initially kind of, listens in at the door and hears some noise, hears some scratching and moving around, then opens the door and finds a barren room with a cot and some blankets. Initially, what he thinks is a scarecrow laying on the cot. His attitude is calmed as he sees this. Oh, okay, now I understand. And then it starts moving. And so we have that eerie experience of the expectation of absence, and instead we get presence. And it starts, moving around and twisting and roiling, and it is a skeletal kind of corpse-like figure. And so it moves with all the alacrity you would expect a desiccated corpse to move with, i.e. it has no muscle tissue to speak of, so it just kind of writhes around. I mean, despite the fact that the ghost is kind of helpless, laying under a sheet, the narrator is, of course, terrified and, slams the door and all of that. The hosts quickly figure out that the narrator has seen something, they approach him and warn him off, advising that this ghost figure was a villainous person who occupied the house previously and is just existing in a form of eternal torment in this one particular room. Another story that I read by M.R. James is The Haunted Dollhouse. Now, this one I read a while ago, but I liked it so much I actually ended up kind of constructing a Call of Cthulhu scenario about it. Basically, it's a tale of sympathetic magic, which is a term that can be attributed originally to James George Frazer and his book The Golden Bough. So sympathetic magic is essentially the idea, you might hear it in terms of a rule, maybe in among witchcraft adherents, as above, so below. This is the attribution of connections between similar things. So, for example, if an easy example might be the zodiac. So, if you're born under a particular star sign, the representation of that star sign might turn up in your personality in some way. So this is, and also the classic kind of trope, we'll call it, because it may not. I don't think it's truly an accurate representation of the religion, but certainly it is a trope that's turned up in movies. The voodoo doll. The idea that you could have like a doll or a puppet of a particular person, you could harm that doll or puppet and thereby harm the person. So the Haunted Dollhouse is a good example of this. It is a dollhouse that is purchased by the narrator, again, kind of an M.R. James insert. The narrator sees things going on in the dollhouse and then finds a similar house where the occurrences in the dollhouse are reflected in real life. Arguments, trials and difficulties in a family, fighting, that sort of thing, potentially even violence. All of this can happen with the dollhouse and the dolls, but then it also can happen in real life. And I think that is kind of another example of the expectations that we have being turned on their head. At once, the dollhouse, it's a toy, it's an amusement, but yet it has these kind of real-world implications. And then secondly, the fact that these real-world implications are happening with something in another location definitely smacks of sympathetic magic. And of course, I think it also smacks of a no full frontal approach, in that we're not certain what's even causing this. There's no understanding. There's no kind of structure or connection in M.R. James's story other than what we are bringing to the table ourselves. Why does a dollhouse suddenly take on a representation of a family in a regular larger home? There's no explanation given, so you're left to understand, or left to interpret on your own. Is it a witch's curse? Is it, some sort of truth about how life works? Is it just kind of a supernatural mystery? We don't necessarily know. I mean, was it an accident even? Somebody just happened to create a dollhouse that was like a house, put the appropriate dolls in it, and suddenly it works. I mean, certainly that kind of lends a degree of cosmic horror to the situation. M.R. James also has a story called The Malice of Inanimate Objects. And in this, he provides a couple of examples about people going through their daily lives and having misfortunes take place, to the extent that the general belief surrounding the stories was that there was some sort of malignant spirit at work. People who would repeatedly have accidents, anything ranging from like stubbing their toes to having their house burned down. The idea that people could potentially be cursed, or that even the objects that people interact with could kind of bite them back in a way. This is kind of the point of the Malice of Inanimate Objects, which really comes off more like an essay than it does a ghost story, although there's definitely some ghost story elements. This does dovetail, actually, a little bit with Casting the Runes, which I said I wouldn't talk about, other than the fact that I'll just mention there is kind of a malice of inanimate objects at play in that story as well, especially with kind of the finale, and how the end doesn't come from any potential spirit or ghost, but just what might be a tragic accident, an insanely coincidental accident. And so I think this is actually kind of a great example of the no full frontal approach. Not only do we not have an image of like a malignant spirit or a specter or a ghost or anything like that, but we literally have nothing with the Malice of Inanimate Objects. It's just people having bad luck and misfortune. And I'll put kind of a caveat here that definitely I'm going to keep this in my back pocket for the next time I'm running a game that potentially involves the supernatural and people start rolling poorly. Sometimes in games, rolls cluster. And so you can get kind of a series of bad luck rolls repeatedly at the table, whether it's in person or digitally. And so to have the explanation of a potential supernatural entity at work, the idea that you have a character that, maybe rolls poorly and they're trying to hide, but they stub their toe and they cry out, and the person that they were hiding from suspects them, starts chasing them. As they're running and fleeing, maybe another roll, maybe somebody ends up in front of them, or an object ends up in front of them that trips them up. and maybe they even stumble out into the middle of the street and get hit by a car. All of this could be explained with kind of supernatural components that you never really see happening. But the fact is they are happening. It is obvious because of the results, the consequences of the supernatural are present, even if the supernatural isn't present. So I find that kind of an interesting use of the no full frontal rule. And finally, I'm going to end on this was a story that kind of surprised me in that there's really not a lot to it. And I mean, that's how ghost stories kind of go sometimes. There's really not a lot to them. It's more kind of the build-up and the atmosphere and all of that. And this is the M.R. James story, The Vignette. And this is very much a no full frontal situation. It's also definitely a situation of presence where there should be absence, in that we have another kind of narrator, M.R. James insert, who ends up exploring a garden near his house. Actually kind of reminds me of my own story a little bit. This man explores this garden and lives near it, talks about living near it, talks about how kind of it figures into his daily walks, talks to other people about it. And there's kind of this ominous sense throughout the story, but nothing happens right until the end. And at the end, there is just this little moment where the garden gate shuts, and through a hole in the garden gate, the man spies a face. Now, again, we don't see the whole body of whoever's behind there. It just kind of is like a childlike face. And one might even picture it as maybe not a ghost story necessarily. I mean, we think about ghost in the traditional sense of someone who is dead, who has come back. But this is instead maybe even kind of a story of fairies in the garden or something to that effect. Ghost can mean a lot of different things. You don't necessarily, that's one aspect of the no full frontal that I really like, is that you don't have to frame up a ghost as a dead person necessarily. And there's no rule that says you have to. Of further note, I'm just going to add, Johnny Mains has edited a collection called Illusions of Presence, which is a book about Christmas ghost stories. A lot of them kind of uncovered and published for the first time. Johnny Mains, if you're unfamiliar, does a variety of works for the British Library, has, 5 collections that I'm aware of now, ranging from kind of seasonal collections to books about particular kind of Celtic and Scottish lore. And I find this work particularly interesting because it focuses in on Christmas ghosts, and that's definitely a subject that interests me as someone who enjoys now in my adult life the Christmas ghost story tradition. So I'm not going to go through too many of the stories. I'm just going to go through the first one. So this is a story called In Deadly Peril. The author is John Pendleton. It was originally published in an 1887 edition of the Belfast News. And a kind of a summary of what this is about. This is about a journalist who visits a coal mine and kind of wants to understand the inner workings of the coal mine. And as a result of wanting to have a tour of the place, comes across a curse and almost runs afoul of it himself. The coal mine is very much kind of an underground world, all its own, has different rules, different laws apply there, and this is why the supernatural can kind of exist in this place. The notion of the curse, also kind of an interesting one, the idea that the mine claims a life before the dawn of Christmas Day every year. And this journalist ends up with a strong boss who ends up going mad in the depths of the mine and tries to kill him, tries to make the journalist the life that the mine takes every year. It's sort of you can almost think of it as kind of a possession story in a way, that the mine kind of has this malignant personality all its own and ends up possessing the strong boss, and the strong boss ends up trying to kill the interloper, the journalist, so as to spare the lives of any other workers. that might run afoul of the curse. And this is certainly an example of no full frontal in that, we don't even see a ghost in the story, but the ghost is implied throughout. And definitely a sense of the eerie here, where we are expecting to find nothing and we find something. But we don't find it exactly in the way that we're expecting to find it. We're expecting to go down into the mine and see something monstrous. It's not there, but it's inside the person that we happen to be standing beside and who is essentially our guide in this story. So as a final thought, I'd like to bring in one more Johnny Main's collection, and that's Celtic Weird. This is another one that he put together, and it includes a Robert Aikman story that I'd never come across before and was quite taken with. Robert Aikman, if you don't know, he's kind of like Thomas Ligotti, at least as far as I see it. He's kind of a horror writer's horror writer. I see a lot of prominent horror writers kind of talk about with reverence Robert Aikman, even though Aikman really isn't. I mean, he isn't a horror writer in the traditional sense. He isn't terribly like ghoulish. He isn't bloody or anything like that. But he certainly writes things that are weird and things that will surprise you. His best known story is called The Hospice, which is about a very weird kind of hotel and a dinner party that goes along with it. But this lesser known story, it got to me in different ways. It got to me in a different way than a lot of ghost stories get to me, in that I was truly made uncomfortable by the presence of the supernatural in this story. This story is called The Fetch. It's from a collection that Aikman published in 1980. And it's a story that follows the course of a man's life. And what's interesting about it is that you see this man go through all his years, including kind of inheriting his family's old castle property in Scotland. But throughout it, and with at various times, there is also the other thing this man inherits is the family ghost. Now, this isn't a ghost in the traditional sense. By fetch, what he means is, or what Aikman means, is a creature that comes to fetch the dead, or comes to collect the souls of the dying. It's actually kind of like having your own personal Grim Reaper. And Aikman's main character, Aikman's narrator, sees the fetch as kind of a particular woman, kind of an unassuming woman. There's nothing spiritual or spectral about her. She just kind of she wanders in whenever somebody's dying, and manages to show up in ways that are, well, surprising and eventually terrifying, because he initially sees the fetch. He sees this kind of unassuming woman turn up for a family death when he is a child. The woman just kind of wanders into the family home like she belongs there, which is strange to a child, and it's kind of recounted with a child's memory of the situation. Later on, and I would say actually probably the biggest scare in this story actually for me came midway. And maybe it's just because of, where I am in my life that I related to where this man was in his life, and the sudden death of someone you love being a fear of mine, certainly. At one point, the man he's living in a modern apartment, I think in London, and he takes the building has 2 glass elevators, and he takes one of them down to go to work, and in the process he sees the unassuming woman, the fetch, coming up in the other elevator, presumably to come after his spouse. And that was truly upsetting for me, I think, maybe just on a personal level, and in kind of my journey to understand kind of my own existential crisis and all of that, the idea that death can strike suddenly, and to represent it in that way, and in a way where, it's right there, you can see it coming, but, it's two glass elevators, you're not in the same one, she's going up, you're going down, so there's no possible way to prevent anything, to stop anything. You just have to endure the crushing crisis as you run and call the elevator to go back up the other way, and of course he's too late. Eventually as well, the fetch ends up coming for the narrator. This kind of when he inherits the family property, it resolves in a way where he's kind of inherited the family debt, and that includes this ghost that comes to take you at the end. And that in itself, I could relate certain things to that, but for some reason it was just, I read it at a time when that particular kind of middle period of the story of this man's life really grabbed hold of me. And it is another kind of, it's an interesting example of kind of how our two rules work, the trade-off of the eerie and of course the no full frontal. There's definitely full frontal in this, in that, the man sees the ghost. However, it is kind of eerie because the ghost is very unassuming. It's not a frightful spirit or anything like that. It's just kind of something, it's as mundane as a delivery driver. But, knocking at the door, the delivery is not something that you want. So we're not going to get out of this conversation about ghosts without you giving me a few minutes to talk about Alison Rumfitt, and specifically Alison Rumfitt's Tell Me I'm Worthless. Most people who know me know that I have a particular fondness and affection for this book, not just because of the material and how it picks up on the cultural zeitgeist in a way that I envy as a creative person, and I want to replicate in my own time. And that is an Everest that I want to climb at some point, is to be able to produce a work of horror that hones in meaningfully on the present cultural moment. But also, Rumfitt does a couple of things with ghosts that are very unique, techniques that I've never seen elsewhere. Maybe they exist elsewhere, but for me it was Rumfitt that introduced me to these ideas. And they actually translate kind of well to the gaming table. I was really surprised. I did attempt to utilize them immediately after seeing them. I went out and created a scenario that attempted to borrow from some of Rumfitt's key ideas and presented this to my players, my personal group of players. And I was struck by how well some of these alternative notions of ghosts worked. The first that was particularly interesting to me was it shows up at the beginning of Rumfitt's book, Tell Me I'm Worthless. And without spoiling the book too much, essentially it's a scene where a character experiences a ghost catching them and tearing them to pieces while they are in a panicked state fleeing the ghost. So the ghost hasn't caught them in any particular way, but the player, or the main character, is aware of what the ghost will do to them, has a complete end-to-end vision of their own personal destruction at the hands of this ghost. And I think it's a rather novel idea. And I experimented with it. We played through kind of a similar scene. This is, for those who've read the book, this is the scene involving the poster. In my case, I did something similar with my players. I basically said, tell me about one object in your personal living space that, maybe doesn't agree with your politics, but like your parents gave it to you or something like that. And you've just kept it around because you haven't had time to throw it away or you haven't been willing to throw it away. And so one of my players comes up with this notion that she has a self-help book from Dr. Phil sitting on her desk. And this scene, which we were playing Call of Cthulhu, so there were some sanity losses involved. There was maybe kind of I think there was an opposed power roll that I did as well, as that's kind of a ghost mechanic in Call of Cthulhu. And it ended up with her leaving her suburban home, screaming and running into the dark as she was pursued by Dr. Phil. And I had her, as funny as this scene was, I managed to keep it on the rails by saying, okay, describe to me what's going to happen when he catches up to you. Describe to me, before you roll that roll to see if you can avoid him in a chase, describe to me what your character knows is going to happen to you, or is going to happen to them, if Dr. Phil catches up. And my player in particular she's particularly good at description, and she dove into this headlong, talked about how he'd get his big fat paws around her neck and strangle the breath from her lungs. And it was a marvelous scene by the end. And I think this construction of tell me what the monster is going to do to you before it gets a hold of you adds a depth that isn't there in certain games with certain dice mechanics that determine whether or not an attack succeeds. So that's Rumfit's first contribution to improving my games. The second one it's a little bit more setting specific, but I really like it. And I think it's a good idea to throw in now and again, especially because it livens things up. It changes expectations. It turns expectations on their heads, which is in Rumfit's setting structure. Ghosts can be from the future as well as the past. A significant emotional moment will resonate such that you might get an apparition of someone who is tormented by future events that haven't happened yet, but could happen. And it's kind of like having a dream occur and dreaming a potentially bad future, but there's something more solid to it and something more desperate to it. A dream you can wake up from and you don't have to worry about it. Well, maybe not in Cult, but in most games, a dream is not going to attack you in your waking life. But a ghost from the future that's there proving to you that the bad thing happened and the bad world is waiting for you 5, 10, 20 years down the line is a disturbing notion. And it upends the idea of what we think about ghosts when we think that ghosts are the spirits of the deceased come back to finish business or torment us or whatever their goals are. And I think that's particularly relevant as we maybe talk about some of the most important or some of the most significant Christmas ghosts that are known, well, wherever Charles Dickens has managed to plant his literary flag, living or dead. And that's the the Christmas ghosts from A Christmas Carol, which are not ghosts at all, but rather concepts. I'm not going to go into depth about A Christmas Carol because there are plenty of other resources for analyzing and critiquing it. But there's one thing that I want to bring up about modern retellings and reimaginings of the story. Call this my hot take for the episode, but the Muppets have done us dirty. Now, I love the Muppets. They are a core piece of childhood nostalgia for me, and it gives me a lot of pleasure to come back to them with adult eyes and see the dark and mature humor that they were putting fully on display when I was watching as a kid, but couldn't tell. But I think they missed a trick with the way that they portrayed the ghost of Christmas Present in their version of A Christmas Carol. In Dickens's original tale, the ghost of Christmas Present has two children hiding underneath his robes. These are feral, ragged creatures that are twisted and monstrous, but also submissive like beaten dogs. These children represent ignorance and want, and they are a comment on the conditions of poverty in British cities. This is where the ghost of Christmas Present is supposed to throw Scrooge's words about prisons and workhouses back in his face. Now, maybe you could argue that including such an image in a Muppets Christmas Carol wouldn't fit the tone, or it wouldn't hit right with modern audiences, or it would scare kids, but we all know the range of the Jim Henson Creature Workshop, and I have to believe that they were capable of representing these children and maybe had plans for it that ended up on the cutting room floor. Hell, they could have thrown in a couple of jaundiced Fraggles and I would have been completely satisfied. But while the ghost of Christmas Present breaks the no full frontal rule, the presence of these kids, and in some depictions I've even seen them chained to his legs, these children are definitely eerie in that they are the last thing you would suspect. And that's a powerful image of society hiding its cruelty that we're missing out on. And it's these kinds of images that make ghosts such a special tool for storytelling. They have the capacity to symbolize things in a way that we just don't see with other supernatural creatures. Sure, you can use a vampire to talk about syphilis or the cruelty of the aristocracy, or you can use a werewolf to talk about the inner savage animal inside the mind of every human being. But with ghosts, you can spell that kind of stuff out in big, bold letters, and the audience can't unsee it, even if they want to. That's the true power of the ghost. It literally has no limitations in what it can represent apart from it has to be something outside the boundaries of the natural world. It can be used to convey messages and meanings and narratives in ways that are impossible to ignore. So now we've reached the point in our episode where it's time for me as the butcher to take you behind the counter and show you how the proverbial sausage is made. Sometimes it's difficult, whether writing or presenting something, to view and appreciate your own work, because you can see the flaws in it. You can see the difference between the behind-the-scenes product and the final cut that the player or the audience sees. You can't help but notice the flaws and the little stitches that keep one attempt and another attempt together to form the final product. But it's curious, I've never really had that issue when it comes to telling ghost stories. I've sort of implicitly understood that my side of the experience of a ghost-related TTRPG is going to be different than the player's side of that TTRPG. Because I know how the ghost was created, and that's the point. The ghost is supposed to be fully formed on my side of the screen, and it's supposed to be partial and incomplete on the other side. That's what makes it kind of frightening. And it's peculiar because as I was researching this episode, I realized that I kind of owed my method of constructing ghosts for the gaming table to Bill Connors of TSR, circa 1992. Bill Connors was in charge of the AD&D 2nd edition Ravenloft setting. And as part of that setting, he produced a series of Van Richten's guides to various supernatural entities. And these rather marvelous guides were very simple instruction books for new GMs on how to put together a certain type of traditional Gothic horror monster. There was one on vampires, there was one on werewolves, there was one on mummies, and there was one on ghosts. And it's really the Van Richten's Guide to Ghosts that has stuck with me and influenced my process in creating these kinds of ephemeral supernatural terrors for a wide variety of games. Not just, I'm long past my Dungeons and Dragons days now, and I know a lot of the folks that listen to this are too, but I think we can come back to this particular resource and mine it for some rather beautiful, simplistic, kind of cut and paste, kind of link the blocks together in any order ideas, and really come away with some weird and wonderful ghostly marvels to show our players at the table. And the really cool thing about it now is that this book is available for free. All you need to do is go to archive.org and look it up. Van Richten's Guide to Ghosts, it's there. So whether you want to go and grab your own copy and follow along, starting on about page 8 with me, or if you just want to listen, I'm going to take you through ghost creation as envisioned by Bill Connors, and we'll see how the sausage is made. The first thing that Connors introduces with this Van Richten ghost system is magnitude of power. So for Connors, this is power level of a given ghost. And that's important for a game like D&D, where level is a factor in terms of what you put up against your player characters and what level they are. But if we're thinking more broadly and in more social horror systems, I would look at this magnitude of power as an opportunity to set the limits of the sandbox for your given ghost. Connors describes the first magnitude of power for a ghost as a ghost that is passive, that is weak, that is really more annoying than anything else. I tend to think of this as kind of the annoying poltergeist level. This is the ghost that can change the channel on your television. It's not going to rip the television off the wall and throw it at you. With the second magnitude of power, Connors asserts that the ghost becomes aggressive and goes from annoying to irritating. And furthermore, stresses that there is some sort of emotional component that is palpable for people observing the ghost. This is something of a fixture in Connors' interpretation of ghosts, and it's very fitting for kind of the Victorian spiritualism and Society for Psychical Research milieu in which the Ravenloft ghosts find themselves. And it's also reasonable for us, but it's important to establish that this is tying ghosts, apparitions, the supernatural, etc., to kind of an emotional energy, an energy that outlasts the human form if it is powerful enough. And so we need to keep that in mind. And so emotion plays a key role with the ghosts going forward. So with a second magnitude ghost, there's some sort of emotional component, some sort of emotional element involving their death or their life that is writ throughout the ghost's existence, and it can be felt by people that are in the presence of this ghost. The third magnitude, we're getting to ghosts that are outright dangerous. They can cripple or kill. They are evil and malicious, and they are highly emotionally charged in terms of their wants and needs. Something dreadfully impactful happened on the emotional scale to put this ghost in play in this particular setting. By the fourth magnitude, we are getting what Connors describes, ghosts that are warped by the power of their own emotions. And at this point, he also stresses, and again, this is kind of a D&D thing, but I think it's relevant for our purposes and something we should consider on a wider sort of scale for inventing and developing ghosts for general horror TTRPGs. A fourth magnitude ghost cannot be driven off by conventional means. There is no "the power of Christ compels you." There has to be something specific about the ghost that is used against it in order to drive it off. And this forces the intrepid ghost-busting parties to learn a bit about their adversary in the process. And this is really where that kind of Call of Cthulhu type research comes in handy. You want to research your haunted house or the particular people that might have lived in an area to understand what the ghost is all about. Then there's the fifth magnitude ghost. And Connors doesn't give more than a couple of examples of this, saying that these really don't exist within the setting. But I think we can kind of look at this from a broader perspective and pull something from it. A fifth magnitude ghost, according to Connors, has a unique way to be destroyed or eliminated. It's not just going to be finding, what their family business was and solving it or anything like that. It's like no other spirit. And furthermore, there is this capacity for a fifth magnitude ghost to warp the land around them. And this really gets me thinking about Alison Rumfitt's Tell Me I'm Worthless, and the house that is transformed by fascist ghosts, layer upon layer of abusive fascist ghosts, and how that house has kind of interesting properties as a result, as those ghosts over generations compact upon one another and even kind of reach into the future to find fascism to draw power from, and how we truly get some remarkable scares, and how ultimately the land itself needs to be destroyed and bulldozed in order to eliminate the presence, because the ghosts have soaked their way into the foundations. They have embedded themselves in the space. After talking about magnitude, Connors goes into how we fill this ghost sandbox that we've decided on the scope of for ourselves, and looks at various factors that make up a unique ghost. This is kind of our building materials. The first thing we need to pick out is physical consistency. Connors gives us kind of a scale from incorporeal through semi-corporeal all the way to corporeal, and then also offers the option of a ghost's physical consistency being mutable, meaning it can change between these levels depending on circumstances. So an incorporeal ghost, pretty self-explanatory, but just to go through it, this is how I would picture kind of your typical movie ghost. A non-physical being that cannot touch, or if it does touch, it touches in some sort of psychic way, as opposed to a physical way. Semi-corporeal, we're into a realm that I tend to actually think of the game Wraith the Oblivion when I think of a semi-corporeal ghost, because with Wraith, your player characters are needing to build the ability to reach out and touch the physical world. So most Wraith-type characters are somewhere on that semi-corporeal state or semi-corporeal scale. They can touch or interact with the physical world in some way, but that's going to vary depending on, how they're built and how their powers are created. Just like any ghost we might use as an adversary in a horror game. Then we've got corporeal. And for corporeal, I mean, that is the M.R. James ghost as far as I'm concerned. That is that's the ghost from Rats. That is a creature that is physical in nature, that we can see, hear, smell, touch, taste, I suppose, if we have to. And it's just like us in terms of how it physically interacts with the world. It just has a supernatural component in that we know this person is dead. And therefore, it's all the more frightening that they are still here and physically interacting with the world. This is kind of your Victorian ghost. Before we had kind of the see-through type stuff that came along with spirit photography and other tricks that were pulled by spiritualists, ghosts were really understood as physical beings. And then there's mutable as a category, which means that we can change things over time. And I mean, that definitely is, as far as I'm concerned, the game master's prerogative or the director's prerogative to make changes as they see fit behind the scenes. Again, keep in mind, this is how we make the sausage. No one knows this. No one knows that you've decided to make your ghost corporeal when you initially thought it was going to be incorporeal. So don't be afraid to change the rules at the last minute, because no one really knows the rules except you. Once we've figured out physical consistency, Connors has a whole toolbox for us to look at in terms of options for this ghost, things that we can put in our sandbox. Some of these lists are rather lengthy, so I'm going to attempt to pare them down, bring them together. But of course, if you look at the book itself, you'll see everything distinctly there. So the first trait that Connors wants us to look at is physical appearance. And the first option is kind of a vaporous or spectral ghost. So is our ghost something that we might mistake for the wind blowing debris around? Or might we mistake it for smoke or fog? And is it possible that that smoke or fog or wind or what have you has a vaguely familiar shape? Could we discern a head, a torso, and two arms from it, for example? Those are our vaporous and spectral ghosts. Secondly, there's a general appearance ranging from humanoid to bestial to monstrous to an object. So we have to ask ourselves, is our ghost of a human being looking like a human being? Or is it looking some other way, and why is that? For example, why would a ghost have a bestial form? What comes to mind immediately is a curse for me. I think about maybe we've got a human being who is a particularly wretched puppy-kicking bastard, and so a curse is placed upon him in that his afterlife, he lives his life as a dog, and learns a bitter lesson as a result of that. I could see that as a bestial ghost. In terms of monstrous ghosts, I've just finished playing Silent Hill F, and there are certainly some examples of monstrous spirit creatures in that, creatures that have been tormented by existing in the spirit realm and being prisoners of that place, such that they are missing features or have other features enhanced. They might have no eyes but giant teeth, for example. And this could be kind of a monstrous appearance that maybe our spirit takes on because of how it has suffered, either in life or in afterlife. Finally, the idea that a ghost could be an object, this takes us back to M.R. James and the maliciousness of inanimate objects. I mean, we're right there. Not only is the ghost maybe toppling inanimate objects on us, maybe it actually is the inanimate object. And I mean, this could be something very personal to the ghost in the sense that a ghost might haunt its own urn, or maybe a picture of itself, Or it could be something a little bit more distinct. A ghost might, something more distinct from itself, but still relevant. Maybe the ghost might haunt the grandfather clock that it used to keep in its house. Somehow that grandfather clock is related to it, and therefore it takes on the shape. Next, we have to ask ourselves, how much does this ghost look like it did in life? Is it preserved? Is it corrupted? Is it distorted? Is it beauteous? All four of these examples give us different ghosts. A preserved ghost would look like it did in life. We would see the body uncorrupted. Whereas a corrupted ghost, we might be looking at a body after it's been in the ground for a year or so. Skeletal, flesh falling off, maybe covered in worms and maggots. A real kind of negative experience of the afterlife where the ghost feels itself rotting. A distorted appearance, this is kind of like a monstrous appearance, but I would compare it more to a funhouse mirror. Instead of having no eyes and teeth, maybe, the eyes of our ghost are particularly small, but the teeth are particularly large. Maybe that has something to do with who they were as a person in life. And finally, a beauteous ghost. And for this one, I am drawn immediately to think of the scene in the firehouse in the Ghostbusters, where Ray looks up and sees this beautiful woman floating above him. Maybe this is an opportunity for our ghosts to express themselves in a way that they want to be viewed. Maybe we have, our ghost is a 90-year-old wretched miser who kicks off. But when they come back as a ghost, they are a 20-something, a young man at that point. Maybe that's how they remember themselves and how best they want to think of themselves. And, maybe something negative happens if that image is distorted in any way or pushed back upon in any way. Connors talks about ghost origins as a way of setting them up, separating them from one another, and gives us a few options here as well. Again, there's a lot of discussion of emotion within these options. These are options that provide various emotional states that would produce a ghost, and this is keeping in line with kind of that Victorian spiritualism perspective on ghosts, maybe even the Society for Psychical Research, the idea that there is somehow some connection between ghosts and untapped human potential for psychic abilities, that they are somehow one and the same. And so the first thing that Connors discusses within this structure of origin is sudden death. The fact that a sudden death of a person in an emotional state might produce a ghost as a result. Somebody might be very angry, very sad, very happy even, and then a bus hits them. What happens to all of that emotion? It has to go somewhere, right? And in the framework of spiritualism or the Society for Psychical Research, that emotion outlives the body and stays on Earth. Another factor that Connors looks at for origin is dedication or stewardship. The idea that the ghost has something on Earth that it needs to maintain close watch over, or some factor that it can't ignore, and therefore it won't leave until that factor is appropriately dealt with or guarded in some way. It might be dedication in terms of watching over its family, or it could be stewardship in that maybe its property belonging to its family is now in the hands of like a nasty real estate developer, and it needs to make sure that the appropriate property is passed on to the appropriate family member. Along the lines of that, you have justice and vengeance, kind of two sides of the same coin as far as I'm concerned. It's really just a matter of perspective. A ghost has some sort of grievance it wants to resolve. I suppose you could divide up justice and vengeance in terms of whether the ghost would allow others to solve its grievance for it, to achieve justice on its behalf, or if the ghost insists on taking its revenge itself. Then Connors brings up a rather interesting one. Now, this is another kind of D&D trope, but I feel like it's a space that we can play in a little bit, and that's reincarnation. Older editions of D&D always had reincarnation spells and the like. So maybe this would be kind of a reincarnation gone wrong situation. But we could transpose that into any other game, realistically, as long as it allows for ghosts and the supernatural. I mean, why couldn't we have somebody who's supposed to be reincarnated as a slimy eel get, lost along the way, and suddenly we have this slimy eel-like ghost that's tormenting the living person's previous victims. Along these lines, we also have curses and dark pacts. Now, a curse I've kind of already discussed with the bestial option. Certainly someone could lay a curse upon someone and force them to live out an immortal life, suffering as an undead creature unable to touch or feel or experience, but still having to watch. A dark pact, similar thing, except instead of maybe a person laying the curse, you have a demon or some sort of demonic entity toying with the person. Maybe they asked for immortality and the demon's rubbing its paws together saying, I'll give you immortality. And that's how we end up there. Our next list from Connors is rather short, and this is options for anchors for a ghost. He only really gives 3 options here, and these would be things that would draw a ghost back, keep a ghost close. And they include relationships, places, and items. So these would be things that would draw our ghost nearby. I mean, it might be that the ghost is attached to a particular person, their relationship to them, so as a result, the ghost hangs out nearby. Ghost might have an attachment or an affinity to a place, therefore it would always be encountered in that place. And finally, the ghost could be attached to an item. Again, we're back to the M.R. James maliciousness of inanimate objects, but this time it's about the item being valued by the ghost, and so anything that happens to that item might cause a reaction from the ghost. Connors also talks about 3 kinds of triggers for a ghost. So these are ways to indicate when a ghost is going to make its presence known. And I mean, these would be things that the GM would keep in their back pocket and allow the players to bump into over time. So the first of these trigger options is time. So maybe a particular time of day, time of year, a particular important event like a birthday or, say, Christmas might cause the ghost to manifest. The next option is action. So a human being or something else precipitates a series of events that cause the ghost to manifest. You walk into the haunted house. Maybe you walk through the threshold of a particular door. Maybe you touch an object that is significant to the ghost. This causes the ghost to manifest. Thirdly, we have a cyclical trigger. So this would mean that the ghost manifests on a cycle. And I tend to liken this actually to another piece of media that I have to thank the good friends of Jackson Elias for introducing me to, and that's the stone tape. So if you're not familiar with the stone tape, I would absolutely recommend this lovely little British TV movie that was shown around Christmas time as kind of a Christmas ghost story. And it's very much an attempt to analyze and understand ghosts from a scientific perspective. Now, the stone tape theory is actually a theory that certain paranormal experts subscribe to. The idea is that it's not the ghost manifesting, but it is a recording of human events that are so emotionally impactful and so meaningful that they actually get drawn into the very stones and land around them. So the earth itself is retelling a human story. And I mean, this might be, a murder or a frightening event or something like that. But the idea is with a cyclical trigger, this experience plays on repeat. You step into the space and it's like the tape rewinds and plays again. And the tape might even be recorded over a couple times. You might have layers of events that are all haunting the same space, all playing simultaneously, but because they aren't related to one another, you end up with kind of this out of sync experience where, I mean, just kind of thinking in terms of like with places like England, for example, I mean, you could easily have a ghost of a Roman centurion beneath the space where a medieval knight might also have a ghostly appearance, and those two might even be beneath something later, like something from the Victorian period. So you might walk into the parlor of an old Victorian house, you might find a Victorian housemaid screaming, you might suddenly be ridden down by a knight in armor, or stabbed with a spear being held by a Roman centurion. All of these things happening simultaneously, and all of them on repeat. All you have to do is hit whatever the trigger is to set off the recording. So Van Richten's Guide to Ghosts wouldn't be a D&D book if Connors didn't take the opportunity to talk about ghost vulnerabilities and kind of ways to bring down a ghost, because of course in D&D the goal is to slay the monster. And Connors doesn't disappoint here by providing a list of optional vulnerabilities for ghosts. The first three I kind of take as a set, although in D&D parlance they're certainly individual things. Holy water, turning, and holy symbols. Very D&D cleric type solutions to a ghost problem. But at the same time, I think they still have relevance for us in other role-playing games. If I think about one of the origins for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, looking at Karnaki the Ghost Finder, certainly someone that uses flavors of holy water, turning, and holy symbols, although they tend to be more along the lines of magic circles for Karnaki. Then Connors brings up allergens, and I think this is an interesting one, because, well, we think about a lot of supernatural creatures having allergies. Vampires and garlic, werewolves and silver, fairies and cold iron. These are all common enough tropes that people are aware of them. But when it comes to ghosts, I mean, what allergens do ghosts have, if they have anything in particular? I think they'd be something very individual to the given ghost. I could picture, for example, a ghost of a midwife, maybe someone who was mistreated, maybe burned as a witch or something like that. And in turn, the ghost's allergen becomes a favored plant for midwifery in some capacity. And so presenting the ghost with this tool, this herb of its original career and importance on Earth, sets it off in some way. So I think finding an individual allergen for your ghost could be a way to make it unique. Then Connors also brings up special weapons. Now, again, very D&D thing. The idea that a ghost cannot be harmed by normal weapons. You need something that's specially crafted to the task. I still think this could be useful. I think, again, we're kind of looking at the Karnaki approach to the situation. Find that special rod or that special dagger that has the appropriate symbols carved into it, and suddenly you have a weapon that can harm this incorporeal entity. By far the longest section with the largest amount of options for diversifying and differing your ghosts from one another is going to be Connor's list of ghost powers. Now again, this is a very D&D list, and I've actually cut all references in all of these lists to things like D&D magic spells, just because I really don't feel that they're relevant to what we want to do or what I want to do with directing folks on developing their own ghosts and apparitions and unique supernatural creations. But I do think that at the heart of discussing any kind of ghost is how it interacts with the physical world. And you definitely get that in Connor's description of ghost powers. So I'm just going to walk through these maybe in sections as best I can. And what we'll really get is a sense of kind of the flavor and variety of things that a ghost can do. And what I'm hoping is that in this list is something you've never thought of in terms of what a ghost is capable of. I've certainly found a few things rereading this list that have jogged my memory and sent me in different directions. So the first are kind of like some basics, which is that ghosts can turn insubstantial or become invisible. This definitely fits with an incorporeal ghost, and or like a semi-corporeal ghost. The fact that a ghost can go from being partially corporeal to then invisible and incorporeal means that you can have, scenes with the ghost and then have the ghost disappear and not be available. And these might happen due to triggers, or it might happen due to just the individual ghost making the decision to remove itself for whatever reason. Maybe your ghost can only exist because there's only one set of eyes on it. Another thing that Connors talks about is rejuvenation and immunity. The fact of the matter is, in D&D, ghosts can't be harmed by mundane articles, mundane weapons, or anything like that. They have to have some sort of magic harm them, for the most part. And even if ghosts are harmed, they have the capacity to renew themselves in some way. And I think this is something that is transferable to other games and other settings. I think it would be rather interesting to have a ghost where you sight it and you decide to just pull out your gun and open fire on it. And maybe there is injury done to it. Maybe you actually see the ghost fall to the ground dead and then it disappears. But then when it reappears, it's restored, or maybe it still has the bullet holes in it and it's that much more pissed off. I think both options are reasonable, and I think talking about whether your ghost is immune to things or whether it can rejuvenate is helpful in designing it. Creation of undead. Again, a very D&D thing, and almost something I left off because it kind of smacks of D&D magic. But I think there's a couple ways to play with this in other more modern or kind of or traditional horror settings, or even like games that are lower powered, like Call of Cthulhu, at least lower powered on the player's part. A ghost could easily create some form of undead. Maybe that being wouldn't exist on its own. Maybe it would be something as simple as the ghost murders someone and then inhabits their body and walks them around like a zombie. I think that would be a very suitable undead for a ghost to create. What's more, I could see the ghost using the trappings of death as a means to frighten and upset people if that's its goal. There's no reason that a ghost couldn't take a skull from a crypt and work it like a puppet in order to provide a degree of intimidation or fright or frustration. I think we could look at creating undead in a wider frame than just kind of the D&D frame. The next option is the classic D&D ghost power of accelerating aging. I was kind of uncomfortable playing with this as a kid, and I don't really know why. It just kind of set me off. But now as I come back to it, I think the idea that a ghost could advance a player's age or cause them to be weakened in some way is significant, it's meaningful, it feels right for what I'm doing now, and I definitely think I could use something like that now. You could even get a situation perhaps where ghosts these days are having to compete with things like long COVID, and we all know people who suffer from kind of pain, arthritis, long-term disease, and a ghost could easily enact something like this against a player character, and it wouldn't necessarily reveal the existence of the supernatural. It would just give the player character symptoms of something that might be experienced in the mundane world. And I think that's kind of an interesting sort of in the now, in the moment concept that I might be willing to play with the right group of players. Ghosts can cause despair and cause fear. These are specific individual powers in Dungeons and Dragons, but I think that we could move them over into other tabletop role-playing games. And yeah, this, especially the causing despair, I think that's a particularly interesting one and one that I might want to work with a bit. I mean, you have these things. I mean, it speaks to me of things like the suicide forest legend in Japan, and the idea that you would have this particular place that not only is a space where people commit suicide, but a place that almost causes suicide. That kind of that notion of despair. And of course, causing fear, I mean, that's a common enough trope, but I mean, it could be dialed up to 11. I mean, you think about like Pennywise and that creature and how it feeds off children's fear. I think that is, it's an interesting power for a supernatural being to possess, and you would need to have definitely a backstory and a reason behind it, because fear is a very human thing, a thing that is very much of our human or physical dimension. So why does this non-physical being, this being from another place, maybe not even a human being at all, need to feed off of fear? There needs to be something established there. There needs to be some sort of lore behind that a character can look into. Entrancing victims and luring victims. Hypnosis is always something that is available for classic horror. It does have its challenges in terms of some of the tropes associated with Svengali and the like, but a ghost that could entrance or hypnotize a victim, I think, is particularly interesting. Luring a victim as well, I think, specifically luring a victim into danger, I think could be a very meaningful way for a ghost to express itself. And kind of you can get not only the ghost, but then you could get that maliciousness of inanimate objects thing, where you have the ghost lure someone directly under a chandelier that falls on them, or something to that effect. Also, entrancing and luring sort of puts me in mind of certain scenes from the Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House. Causing paralysis and causing revulsion. Well, paralysis, yeah, most games that have some sort of physical rule set for combat and the like are going to have a paralysis function. And I think utilizing that as a ghost option, I think that's a good one. And also it's a particularly, if the paralysis is prolonged, you could even make it particularly scary. I mean, cult, you could use a move, put somebody in a dangerous situation, suddenly they're paralyzed, and the ghost has free rein to torture them however they like. Causing revulsion, I think that's one that might be underutilized. I think that, ghosts, we work a lot, we talk a lot about, kind of the sense of touch and ghosts, kind of, what can ghosts touch, what can ghosts interact with. But there are 4 other senses to play with. And it brings me back to kind of the Call of Cthulhu, or not Call of Cthulhu, but the Dunwich Horror. And as a foulness shall ye know them. And so the idea that a ghost would produce some sort of effect of taste or smell that might cause revulsion, might cause your gorge to rise, might cause you to throw up, your eyes to water, what have you. I think that could be very interesting. Maybe even if you use this kind of power alongside a corrupted ghost, a ghost that shows its decay, you might get a very interesting result there. Within this, I would also add, again, this is a D&D thing, but also kind of a cultural thing, the keening of a banshee, the sad wailing of a banshee that causes others to fear or creates dread in their hearts or creates sadness in their hearts. I think this is a very specific D&D ability, but I think again, we're back to that idea that ghosts have more than just touch at their hands, or at their in their toolbox. Sound is something that a ghost can utilize in order to produce an alien effect to harm people or to drive people away. So, I mean, with causing revulsion, you've got that smell and taste, but now we're adding sound as a component too. Causing wounds. For some reason, I just can't get over the idea of how cool it is just to have a ghost able to rip somebody's skin open telekinetically. I think that is a marvelous and frightening idea. And I would love to use it more in games. I have definitely had games where ghosts caused wounds. I remember fondly a particular game where a ghost manifested a sword, and then one of my players had the idea to draw a sword off a display on a wall and try and challenge it to a duel. It ended very badly for the player, and they ended up spending most of the game in bed with a serious wound, having to kind of like shout their ideas to the other players who were wandering about the haunted castle. Charming animals and charming people. Well, again, we're back to D&D powers here, but I kept these in specifically because I think that they could be relevant in other games. When it comes to charming people, I mean, it doesn't have to be like a charm spell necessarily, although a fey glamour or something like that can certainly work in a variety of games. But with charming people, it may be a seduction. It may be something that a beauteous ghost, for example, could achieve. I mean, I think Ray Stantz in that moment in the Ghostbusters when they were sleeping in the firehouse was certainly charmed. At the same time, I think charming a person can also mean kind of moving them to your side of things. This gives me kind of the thought that maybe a ghost has an opportunity to see inside your head and other people's heads. And as a result, they might be able to, turn your own thoughts against you. Suddenly, the ghost whispering in your ear is making terribly good sense, saying that, your friends have it in for you, that they don't have your best interests at heart. And I mean, if you're using that in conjunction with another power like causing despair or something like that, the ghost may end up with a rather despondent ally who in a moment of losing stability, like in Cult, or in a fluctuation of sanity, like in a Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green game, you could easily end up with that person attacking their own allies on behalf of the ghost, without the ghost fully possessing them. Charming animals is a whole nother kind of ball of wax, but I think it's something that again is kind of overlooked for ghosts. We think of vampires and maybe werewolves as charming bats and wolves and the like, but what's to stop a ghost from possessing or charming or manipulating the creatures inside its haunted house and using them against the players? I mean, suddenly a ghost could have an army of rats or cockroaches or spiders in its service doing what it would like. I mean, you could even have all three. You could have, the spiders weaving Charlotte's web, a joke, look out for the rats, and then turn around and the rats are running up the stairs ready to run you over and devour you. That could be a lot of fun. Creating illusions. This could be interior or exterior. It really depends on how you want to frame things. I mean, a ghost could actually create an illusion that is like a hologram or like a shared delusion of some sort. Alternatively, the ghost could create illusions in a person's own mind. And I think both of those are excellent options to give a ghost some more things to do to torment people that are locked in a space with it. I think that would particularly, the idea of an imprisoned ghost who can create illusions is particularly worthwhile because, I mean, they have this space, they can't leave this space, but this space becomes their playground. And we see this in haunted houses all the time, the idea of like hallways extending, staircases and doors moving where they shouldn't, that sort of thing, or not being in the right place. This is a very haunted house thing. And I mean, if you want some good examples of it, again, I can't recommend enough Alison Rumfitz, Tell Me I'm Worthless. The house in that book is absolutely the incarnation of fascist evil, and it does all the wicked things that you would expect it to do. Dominating victims. Well, again, we're back to D&D spells, but we're starting to get in the direction of possession at this point. And the fact that, a ghost couldn't just, convince you to do something. I think there's definitely a difference between a ghost convincing you to do something that would not be in character for you and a ghost forcing you to do something that would be out of character for you, almost as though you're kind of a passenger in your own body as your body makes the movements. Pick up the knife and stab your friend. This is something that a manipulative ghost might do one way, but a dominant ghost might do entirely different. And there might even be different evidence for this. I mean, someone who's manipulated by a ghost into attacking their own friends, they would have a very different experience than, say, someone who was just mentally forced. That person that was mentally forced, we might see their nose bleeding, or maybe I could picture blood coming out of their eyes or ears, as well as the ghost forces their will upon them. Draining abilities and draining energy, now we're kind of into Call of Cthulhu territory, in that the Call of Cthulhu ghost, the kind of default attack for that is to take magic points. And there's no reason you couldn't do that in other games as well. Basically absorbing somebody's strength until they are comatose, or absorbing somebody's insight until they're practically drunk with their feelings, or that has like an inebriated sensation as a result. They can't think straight. Or maybe even, absorbing somebody's charisma until they're completely unlikable. I mean, that sounds awful as well. Speaking of awful things, here's another example from Connors that I find particularly dark. The idea that a ghost might drain memories. Maybe a ghost has such a bad experience of life that they want to take your experiences and use them in place. So they grab memories from you. And suddenly, you're attacked by a ghost, and, maybe you fall down the stairs and your back hurts or something like that. But you can't remember what your parents looked like. I mean, that's kind of an awful experience. And it's a very isolating experience because no one else can see that your memories are gone. So possession of bodies and objects, we're now into the full-on possession. And, this can either be the manipulation of the body however you like in kind of a puppetry manner, or we've got the objects, we've got the M.R. James maliciousness of inanimate objects. Lastly, telekinesis. Good classic, very Society for Psychical Research and Victorian spiritualism, the idea that a ghost can levitate or move things, and that levitation or moving things might vary depending on the ghost's power level. Again, I spoke early on about the idea that there's a difference between a ghost that can change the channels on your television remote and a ghost that can rip the TV out of the wall and throw it at you. So despite this being a holiday episode, I don't really have a way to put a bow on it to finish it off. No real final thoughts other than remember the rules when it comes to ghosts and remember to break them when you need to. I'm enjoying putting these podcasts together, and I haven't run out of ideas just yet, so there's more to come. I'm still working on finding my format and my voice a little bit, but I have a feeling a solution will present itself with enough practice and iteration. I'm delighted to see there's about a classroom worth of listeners tuning in. Feel free to reach out to me at Delapore Media on Blue Sky if you have questions or topics you think might make for a good episode. Also, please take a moment to give the show a positive rating if you enjoyed it. I'll be presenting a game and taking part in a couple of panels this coming weekend at Illusion and Horror Con on Discord. And I've made plans to attend Breakout Con and Comic Con in Toronto in March. Hopefully I'll be running a game or two over the 4-day weekend. I'll be back in the new year with some more horror inspiration, existential dread, and verisimilitude. Until then, happy holidays, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Delapore Media Podcast. You can find a variety of horror gaming resources at www.delapore.media. That's Delapore spelled D-E-L-A-P-O-R-E. Delapore Media, toward verisimilitude in tabletop role-playing. Take care. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Somebody Think of the Children, a suburban horror scenario where moms take on the Cthulhu mythos. Available for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, and now available at a steep discount at DriveThru RPG. Check out the discount link in the show notes.